thank you for coming to Austin. I'm so glad that the Austin Union has invited you. You're going to be debating Ilya Shapiro tonight. And this is a short interview, so we're going to keep it snippy for the Gen Z attention span. You're infamous for talking about monarchy, for your ideas on monarchy. You've criticized democracy, and you've described the West as a declining oligarchy. So let's start off by you explaining these ideas. Why do you describe the West as an oligarchy, and why is democracy bad?
I describe the West as an oligarchy for a very simple reason, because policy decisions and final policy decisions on what the government does and does not do are taken by a small group of people. That's essentially Aristotle's definition of an oligarchy: rule of the few. And it's very easy to translate the word oligarchy into a word that basically all intellectuals understand. I would say meritocracy. In other words, basically, influence and control in the world we live in lies in the hands, essentially, of prestigious institutions. And, an oligarchy is always an oligarchy of institutions. There's always some structure that defines who matters and who doesn't matter.
And speaking about the government, would you define those more as bureaucrats, or would you also include like senators and representatives as oligarchs?
So, the senators and representatives come out of the old Roman Republic, oligarchical system. But if you look at what senators and representatives actually do in D.C., they basically, raise money and deliver sound bites. These are not legislators in any sense that a real parliamentary system would recognize. They're not independent actors. They don't sit around debating policy. They don't wear togas, and so, that is sort of a kind of a symbolic oligarchy that has mutated into something different. And what we actually see in terms of, the sort of two sides of Washington, what you call the deep state, or the administrative state, as scholars say, which is the bureaucracy, the civil service, the permanent government employees within the executive branch agencies, and who are overwhelmingly responsible not to the president, but rather to Congress, which is basically dictating how these so-called executive agencies work. The other side of this is what I call the cathedral, which is the brain and the voice of the state. So the brain being the university and the voice being the prestige press. And you can look at any of these institutions and say, okay, these are, the prestigious institutions of the time, of the period. What does prestige mean? Well, it doesn't mean they're like mentioned in the Constitution or anything like that. Nothing says in the Constitution that there even is a New York Times. But nonetheless, if you basically said, well, I want power in this system, and my choice is to control the New York Times or to control the rest of the entire U.S. government, I might actually choose the New York Times, which, by the way, is a fifth-generation hereditary absolute monarchy.
Let me dig into that more. I've heard you describe Apple, the New York Times, as monarchies. What is the definition of a monarchy?
So a monarchy, according to Aristotle, now Aristotle does this thing where he has basically not three kinds of government, but six kinds. He's got good and bad of each kind. So monarchy versus tyranny would be Aristotle's structure. I find it's better not to mix those value judgments with objective descriptions. I believe that any form of government can be good or evil. And when you look at what a monarchy is, it's essentially, the rule of one, but more generally, it represents a pyramid-shaped org chart. So anything with a pyramid-shaped org chart, as long as actual power within that system actually follows that pyramid structure, is a monarchy. Even more specifically, there's a method by which any monarchy, armies, of course, obviously are monarchies in the sense, by which any monarchy works, which is something that the U.S. Military calls mission orders. And the idea of mission orders is simply that if you're anywhere in the hierarchy, you have a goal, you have a mission to accomplish, you have some resources, people who work for you, you divide up your goal into submissions that are given to your employees, and you don't micromanage them. You just say, so in the military, a captain would say, Lieutenant, take this hill. He doesn't say how to take this hill, he's just like, take this hill however you see best. And that, results in the most effective and functional organizations. That's basically the monarchical structure. What you see in oligarchic, especially in bureaucratic systems such as our own, is a procedural system of management where at any point in the hierarchy, your job is to follow the rules. And there are certain, if you're, like, you don't have any initiative, you don't have any choice, you have a system of rules that you at least nominally have to follow. And if you want to put your own initiative or choice into that, you basically have to kind of hack these rules or tweak them. You have to, as I say, manipulate procedural outcomes. And so, that sense of manipulating procedural outcomes, which is a phrase I found on an actual professor's page, that sense of manipulating procedural outcomes is sort of the only place that personal discretion is left within the bureaucratic state. Whereas the monarchical structure, whether it's a corporation, a restaurant which has a chef, a movie which has a director, all of these, an army that has a commander, all of these systems, all these different forms of and purposes of organizing human beings seem to just naturally form into these pyramid-shaped org charts, which clearly outcompete any other structure of organization. Now, what happens at the top of the monarchy? How is the king or president or CEO or whoever picked? What if he dies? Like, these are all, what if he goes crazy, gets a brain tumor? Like, all of these questions are, sort of can be answered in many, many different ways, and still you're clearly within the category of monarchy.
So it seems like you're kind of putting all sorts of companies or societies where there's one sort of central executive power.
Yes,
as a
and
monarchy.
I would say also one variant of monarchy is basically is a diarchy or a triumvirate. So you can actually see what's important is not literally one, but that it has a clear center. So for example, in Silicon Valley, the diarchy, the co-founders is very popular. It works very well. That same structure is used in the Manhattan Project, which is a government project, which also worked very well. You had Oppenheimer and Gross, the technical and non-technical CEO. So that can work. You get more than three, and you start to get these oligarchical structures creeping in again.
So it seems like obviously the system focuses on efficiency and produces a lot of efficiency, and that's what CEOs and people who run companies are looking for. But when we're talking about the government, at least what I learned in school is that the government is supposed to protect your rights. So when we're talking about the government, why would a monarchy be better than a democracy?
Well, protect your rights is a very loaded, complicated question that has, contextual, and, I've been careful to use these words monarchy in ways, that are sort of absolute. I wouldn't have to say anything about any political tradition in order to give the explanation that I just gave. When you say protect our rights, there's a very complicated structure of assumptions behind protect our rights that I'm not sure we have time to go into here. However, what I would say generally is that, suppose the government's job is to grow bananas, then it should grow bananas efficiently. If the government's job is to protect our rights, it should protect our rights efficiently. Personally, I'm not a Christian or, a theist of any kind, but one way of defining, the purpose of government is to say that, any government should be essentially God's regent on earth, and its purpose is to do the will of God. That's a very clear and self-consistent definition of the purpose of government, as long as you're perfectly clear on the nature of God, which not everyone obviously is agreed on.
What do you think the purpose of the government is?
I think it's to do with the will of God.
Okay. How would we deduce the will of God, and who's going to interpret that?
There's the rub. You need basically someone who is, first of all, has a perception of God that is essentially clear and sane, and he needs to be relatively good at it. What you'll find basically across...
How would we evaluate that?
How would we evaluate that? So,
and in who?
In whom? In whom, sorry?
Who would evaluate
Who would
that?
evaluate that?
Good
So
leader?
let's sort of, that's really the right question. So if we step back and we look at the corporate form, we see that the pyramid is only part of it. So if you look at the way that a monarchy like Apple works, first of all, there are some monarchies that are like some corporations that are genuinely absolute monarchies, such as the New York Times or Facebook or Meta. Sorry, in both Meta and the Times, the Sulzbergers and Zuckerberg have special voting share rights that basically makes them effectively unilaterally supreme. So which is cool, which seems to actually, absolute monarchy actually with no accountability structure whatsoever actually works surprisingly well. Guess who is an unaccountable hereditary absolute monarch? A.G. Sulzberger. Seems to put out a pretty good newspaper for as long as you define what a newspaper is in the right way. And so that's, so no accountability at all. That's one option. You see that a lot historically. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's really bad, like anything in some ways. What we see, however, that is a very unusual structure in corporate terms in the private sector. It's much more common to see a board of directors that is actually independent of the CEO and meets once a quarter and says, is this guy doing a good job or girl doing a good job, and or do we need to replace him or her? And what's neat about that structure of, people call it corporate governance. Okay, and then you typically have two levels of structure. You have a board of directors, and then you have shareholders. And so you see this sort of weird thing that kind of looks like a political democracy, but is not quite a political democracy. And its entire goal is to hold the CEO accountable. The closest analog of this at a political level would be simply a constitutional interpretation, which I think is very practical, and is that you are simply electing a president with absolute power, except that he has to hold another election in 4 years. And and so essentially, the citizens become shareholders. Actually, the Electoral College, the early Americans were very familiar with these structures, right? Because actually the corporation was invented before the United States. This is where it was a trading people in New England. And so, if you look, for example, at the Electoral College, one question that you might have looking at the Electoral College is, why do we even have this? What did these people think they were doing when they created this? The answer is they were actually thought that it was a bad idea to pick the president by popular vote because they wanted a board of directors. But what they didn't realize is that they were building a governance system, not an a power structure, not an accountability system, and just like power burned straight through their electoral college. The point really is that what's neat about a board is that the board is not involved in managing the company. It is only interested in looking at the results. And because of that, it doesn't develop weird attachments to policy. It's not starting to govern. It's not actually turning the company into an oligarchy. And a company that's run by its board is, in the corporate world, is almost by definition a weak or failing company. If the shareholders are involved, you're probably hosed.
So if you could kind of redesign the U.S. government or design it according to your views, I'm wondering what that would look like, because you just kind of made an analogy between corporate structure and the government. And you also said, though, that you think that the government's role is to interpret God's will on earth. Mm-hmm. So I'm really wondering, what would your ideal government look like?
Structurally, I think the best answers to those questions, because, as FDR said in his first inaugural, because our system has proved very, very flexible, I think that overwhelmingly the best way to do this is absolutely within the structure of the present Constitution. One of the things about the way the Constitution is designed is that its designers evidently, and they did know quite a great deal about practical political science as well as classical political science. So the three branches are kind of intended to represent the powers of oligarchy, monarchy, and democracy. And one of the neat things about the Constitution is that it doesn't specify the precedence of the branches. It sort of leaves it up to the needs of the moment. And so in more stable times, kind of more procedural and more broad-based forums are needed, where when you're in a situation where, like, actually, you know, a more coordinated action is needed, you are going to want to trend toward the more monarchical structures. What we see in U.S. history is that about every 75 or 80 years, we have a basically monarchical presidential administration. The three, that I'm referring to here are Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. It's as regular as like the San Andreas Fault or Halley's Comet. So when Halley's Comet comes around again, to sort of give your question the most practical meaning, when Halley's Comet comes around again, basically, what is the form here? And I think it's clearly, the form of essentially, and this is a totally legitimate reading of the Constitution, that the executive has all of the powers of the executive, and the way to hold him accountable, during his term, the way to hold him accountable is either unelect him the next term or impeach him during the term. And essentially that gives Congress the role of being that board of directors and not much other role.
You've also said, though, that you don't believe in voting. So how would we hold that executive accountable without voting?
Oh, it's not that I don't believe in voting. I don't believe in participating with sort of systems of with a kind of systematic falsity. I would say the reason, to not believe in voting, for example, in most presidential elections, this one was obviously perhaps maybe a little different, but the thing is, people speak as if they were electing a king about these presidential elections. They're like, Trump is in power, Biden is in power. Well, Trump is in office, and Trump in his first term was in office. Trump in this term is actually trying to exercise a little bit of power, and it's astounding. It's like trying to pedal a bicycle that's been standing in the rain for 50 years, right? You're just like, this doesn't work at all. Do the wheels turn, right? But he's actually trying to turn the wheels, which is crazy. Nobody's ever seen anything like it, right? And the, as someone said on Twitter the other day, in the last 72 hours, I just realized that the Republican Party has been controlled opposition for my entire life. And so, if there's a certain amount of truth in what you're participating in, yes, that's good. But if you're participating in something that's fundamentally false for the purpose of feeling good about participating in it, I would say that's actually kind of very meretricious.
So it sounds like as long as you understand who you're voting for, you understand what power they actually have.
As long as you understand what you're doing means.
If you think that they have a power that they actually don't have, then you're actually not doing anything.
Sorry, we're shooting left devationists over there.
So let me hone in on that really quickly, and we can end on this note. You had a big debate with Chris Rufo about the value of right-wing activism, where you seem to argue in favor of a more passive approach. You also have been dismissive of the effectiveness of popular democracy. And as we just said, it certainly looks like, at least for the moment, like activism is effective. And popular vote can change things. Does the election of Trump and the rollback of DEI lead you to question that position?
You got to understand, there's a certain personality type, basically a Jewish personality type, that when we complain, we're complaining, or when we criticize, or even when we're being pessimistic, it's actually possible to be pessimistic in a hopeful way. You can be pessimistic about something basically just to express, guys, this isn't automatic, right?
Are you hopeful about the American Republic?
As a coach of a football team, you can basically go in, and not that I'm the coach here or anything, but you can go in and basically be like, guys, you're going to lose. This team is probably going to beat you, and I want to get you to get the best score that you can, but I don't think you're ready for this game. And to go out and win that game then is just this much better feeling than if you're the overdog. So in a way, I'm just guys, I hate the triumphalism. Remember that you're total underdogs, that even if you do, something that feels unimaginably huge, you haven't done anything at all, really. But do a small thing, then do a bigger thing, then do. So, I think some would say that, Chris has already won this one, and I don't know, maybe I'll give it to him.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the debate with you and Ilya Shapiro, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Can we talk a little bit about the University of Austin experience as the first class in the University of Austin?
It's been awesome. So I hear you have a daughter that's nearing college age.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you
Well,
have.
what should I say to her to persuade her to come here?
Well, I guess it depends on her personality because you definitely have to be self-driven here.
Yeah.
Here you have people that, like, if you have an idea, they will help you do it.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to be experimented on a little bit. You know, you're still figuring out all the wrinkles, but it's been an amazing experience.
And socially, it's been like
Socially, it's been I love how close knit we are. I love like close, small classes.
Yeah.
So I don't know if she's used to like a very big school.
Yeah, I think she'd prefer
or a
something
smaller school, but
smaller,
I
really. Yeah.
and I grew up in like a smaller school, so I've been really loving it.
Yeah.
But
no, what's the thing that's been the rockiest? I'm not asking you to badmouth the school, but what's the thing that's been the rockiest?
Well, honestly, like probably just like learning to live on our own. Because you know we cook for ourselves and
you have
and
a shared
all that.
dormitory
We have a
space.
shared dormitory, but everything like combined because the academics itself are hard, but you get through them. But then when you also have to cook and you have to do your laundry and you're also trying to like go to all these places and I've been, getting the Austin Beacon up and running. They've been doing the Austin Unions, and everything just becomes like a perfect storm.
Right.
So.
Yeah, so it's been high pressure actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, what are your kind of hopes for your
I don't
daughter
know.
or
I think,
danger? Do you see dangers? I mean,
obviously, it should be high pressure, right?
Yeah.
It's like not a time of your life to be to slack off. Although apparently that's how they do it in Japan. But yeah, I mean, it's like the first year of anything. It must be such a different. Like so few people get to participate in an experience like that.
Yeah, it's been super special. And there's been a lot of opportunities just kind of thrown at you. You're kind of drinking from.
How did you decide to come here? What was the?
I didn't want to go anywhere else. And I saw Barry Weiss talk about it. I'm a huge Barry Weiss fan.
Right.
And so I was like immediately on board. Like
what would
doubt in my
really be
mind.
amazing is to come here and debate Barry Weiss. That would be so good.
Well, I'm sure they can make that happen. They will get right on that.
Yeah,
I would love to see that.
Yeah,
Is she a senior?
Yeah, she'll
high
be she'll be a senior next fall. So this is the right time for her to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Sybil's personality is much like mine, which means she doesn't like to be pushed. But I should definitely offer her. I'm sure if she comes out here, she could have some fun conversations and visits. And
do you have fond memories from your undergraduate studies, or?
I have different memories. I have some fond memories and some unfond memories. I had a very strange, undergraduate experience for two reasons. One is that I was a transfer student because I did my freshman year at Hopkins and the other three at Brown, and also I was 3 years younger than everyone else, which is super weird.
You skipped a few grades?
3 grades, So yeah, that was. But also, like at Brown, for example, which has a flexible curriculum, I frankly abused.
Like you create your own.
There's just no core. There's no core at all. You just take classes there. So I managed to like really totally abuse that freedom by taking only engineering classes.
How did you go from like that engineering interest to politics and philosophy?
I've always been interested in these subjects. Actually, how did I not go that way is the right question, because how did I fail to destroy my interest in these subjects? The question answers itself, right? So I'd like to thank Brown for that. Brown, where we are right there. We'll cut that part out. What's funny is that actually the story of how I was like, it was doxed really is a funny story, which is the story. Sorry, the story of how I was doxed is a funny story because, you know,
When you were still anonymous.
yes, actually, and for a lot of people, it was like a year after I started blogging, and for a lot of people, it's like a hostile thing,
Yeah.
right? But actually, somebody just sent me an email and was like, "Hey, I figured out from the way you posted about your grad school and computer science experience, like who you are." I was like, "Okay, well, clearly I don't have. This is before Satoshi, but I was like, clearly I don't have Satoshi tier security going on here." So okay. And then a couple years later, so I was like, I didn't really care. And then a couple years later, there was this sort of Alterna conference called Bill, and I was like, okay, what if I did like 2 talks at the same conference, one under each identity? So at that point, completely blown, right? The funny thing is, and then they started to like interact in a negative way. I think the interaction is more positive now, but it started to have negative interactions. Like I publish my computer science work, and people are like, "Oh my God, this is cute," and then they're like, "Oh wait, it's by the most evil man on the internet," right? So that caused a little bit of friction, and the in any case, and then many years later, COVID happened, and so in 2020, I moved to Reno with my late wife.
Wow.
And there are many fewer. I don't know how to break this news to you, but there's a lot fewer cool people in Reno than in San Francisco. Actually, almost any way you define the word cool, that's going to be true, right? And so, this smaller crowd, and I meet this guy who's actually like, he's still a good friend. He's a very, very cool guy. And he was like, at a certain point, he's like, I don't know if you know this, Curtis. Like, we started hanging out a lot. He's like, I don't know if you know this, Curtis, but I was actually the one who sent you that email. And, it actually wasn't easy. Because he's like a 180 IQ poker player type, right? And so that's how I was doxxed.
You've been really blowing up in the past few months. And
Thanks to the New York Times.
Thanks to the New York Times. J.D. Vance has mentioned you.
Mm-hmm.
Mark Andreessen likes your thinking. What do you think captures them? What do you think is like the sticking point for them?
I think it's just mostly 2 things. One is like just anything, people like that, especially people who are like venture capitalists. Venture capitalists are very, they're very polyamorous, you might say, in their thinking. Not, of course, their personal
what way?
lives. They're like, they can be interested in a whole bunch of cool things, even if the cool things aren't really like each other, even if they actually conflict with each other. So one of them is being a kind of an intellectual novelty, and the other one I think is that basically I don't believe, is a negative belief, is that basically what's really shared is not a belief in some direction or some future or some idea, but a sort of a disbelief and a like disenchantment of the stories that our society grows up telling itself that we used to think were like reality.